Hello again. Welcome back to the story of the Old Testament. This is session 12, our final one, in which we're going to look at the Babylonian exile and the eventual return to the land under the times of Ezra and Nehemiah, and that is the end of the historical thread that we can find in the Bible. In our last session, we talked about the Babylonian attack on Jerusalem. It was a troubled period of time from Josiah to the end, with the Babylonians and the Egyptians contesting back and forth for dominance of that region, and unfortunately the tiny little kingdom of Judah was unable to survive. The Egyptians were replacing kings with brothers, and the Babylonians were replacing kings with brothers, and eventually the Babylonians destroyed the city in its entirety, carried off a large number of people into exile, and we enter into the period of exile about which we know very little except for a few glimpses from the book of Daniel. You may recall that the first arrival, there were three arrivals of the Babylonians, three armies brought against the city under the king Nebuchadnezzar. The first time, when he was brand new, had just taken the throne from his father in 605 BC and was establishing his authority throughout the area, and he took with him the young boys that he was taking as hostages, and Daniel was one of these. In the book of Daniel, there are a few glimpses of Nebuchadnezzar and what the towns might have been like and what the life of Daniel was as it played out. He lived well into his 80s and then died shortly after the arrival of the Persians and their conquest of Babylon in 539 BC. So he lived a very long life, with the assumption that he was probably in his mid-teens when he was taken to Babylon. One of the remarkable aspects of the story of Daniel is that we have a 15, 16, 17-year-old boy providing advice to the great king Nebuchadnezzar, because the first few dreams of Nebuchadnezzar that were troublesome happened shortly after Daniel arrived, and we were told that they were young men, intelligent young men, so he was probably in his teens at the time. Now, we do know from the way events played out that this was an important period in the development of the Jewish faith. Modern Judaism sprang out of the Babylonian exile. We have such things as the organization of the Bible. The Bible at that time was not a book. It was perhaps best described as a recommended reading list. It was a list of scrolls that were most important for a well-educated Jew of the time. The faith was organized because they began creating commentaries and interpretations of the law and so forth. And most importantly, a concept of an omnipresent God developed. You can imagine the distress of a Jewish community that was taken from their temple, which was regarded as the actual dwelling place of their God. They were taken from the area of their temple into a foreign land, a pagan land. The temple was destroyed, and they had no possibility, at least at that point, of ever returning home. So the concept of an omnipresent God was a remarkable thing at that time, because it told them that God was with them in Babylon or wherever they might be. Now, the Babylonian period was only about 50 years. Babylon was a newcomer on the international field. They defeated the Assyrians. They took control of the Fertile Crescent and then collapsed and were destroyed shortly thereafter. They only survived around 75 years as a dominant power in that part of the world, and everything changed with the rise of Persia. This is a lot of history. It gets a little bit confusing, but it helps to understand who the Persians were, where they came from, so that we can understand the events of the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. And these are the ones that deal with the return of the Jews to Jerusalem, the reconstruction of the temple, and the reconstruction of the walls by Nehemiah. If we take a look at the map of Jerusalem, or of Persia, we can see the entire ancient world, and this is a bigger map now. It shows the Mediterranean all the way to the Persian Gulf. The world at that time was dominated by the Babylonians, of course, in the Fertile Crescent. The Egyptians anchored the western end of the Fertile Crescent in their traditional homeland. The area of Turkey had become resettled. After its collapse, there were several small kingdoms that were emerging in the 700s. One of these being the kingdom of Lydia. Some of you may be familiar with the name of Midas, and some may be familiar with the name of Croesus when they talk about someone rich as Croesus. This was an area that was very rich in gold mines at the time, and they were rising in power and influence. But the dominant nation in that part of the world were the Medes. They were a warlike, very rough, semi-nomadic group of people that liked to gallop in and destroy cities and loot and then return home. And they controlled the entire Iranian plateau all the way over to India. Now, in one corner of the Mede kingdom, the Mede territory, was a group of people known as Persians. And let's talk a little bit about who the Persians were. The Persians were a subjugated people. The Medes controlled them, but the king of the Medes, who felt threatened by the rise in influence of the Persians, had married his daughter off to one of the kings of the Persians, and it was this offspring of the Mede princess and the Persian king who gave rise to Cyrus. The Persians were able to take over, under Cyrus, were able to take over the entire Mede kingdom, and then the kingdoms in Anatolia, for whatever reason, thought it was an opportune time to attack the Persians, which made no sense. The Persians really had nothing of value to Lydia, but they lost the battle, and Lydia was absorbed into the Persian Empire 5 years later, and then just a few years after that, Cyrus conquered Babylon and absorbed that into the Persian kingdom. Cyrus died a few years after conquering Babylon, and his son Cambyses, who is not mentioned in the Bible, took it upon himself to attack Egypt, and he absorbed Egypt into the Persian Empire. And so literally in the space of 25 years, starting with Cyrus, the entire ancient world, which had been broken up into numerous smaller kingdoms, was now under the single governance of the Persian Empire. The book of Ezra starts off with a statement by Cyrus that he is releasing various exiled groups. In other words, we get out of the book of 2 Kings, the Babylonians are there, you turn the page, and it's the first line in the book of Ezra, and it's Cyrus saying that he's releasing various exiled groups. 50 years have passed, and the question is, who was he? Who was Cyrus? He was prophesied in the book of Isaiah. If we take a look at the prophecy in Isaiah, it says here that this is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus: I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me. Now, this was written by Isaiah during the time of Hezekiah, during the time of the destruction of the city of Samaria and the attack on Jerusalem by the Assyrians, and it's 200 years prior to Cyrus. But this is in the book of Isaiah, saying that the Lord is going to anoint somebody named Cyrus, and this anointing is an astonishing thing. The Hebrew word, the root word for this particular translation is Meshiach, and it refers to someone who is specially selected by God. And it goes on to say that God's going to go ahead and do it even though Cyrus does not acknowledge him. You don't acknowledge me, you don't worship me, you are not of our faith, but I am going to use you for a specific purpose, and that purpose was to conquer the kingdom of Babylon and allow the Jewish exiles to return and rebuild the temple. And it goes on, and it says that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and the Persians took over the kingdom. This is what happened at the time of the conquest by Cyrus. If we take a look, this happened incidentally in 539 BC. The kingdom of Babylon was destroyed, and there has been a lot of religious art created on that. This is one of the most famous. It is a picture of the handwriting on the wall, and we have the king Belshazzar, who is observing this and is terrified and asks that someone translate or interpret the vision for him, and he is told at this time that there is an old fellow named Daniel who has apparently been in retirement and out of favor with the government by that time, but he is brought into the presence of Belshazzar, who is told that he will die that very night. Now, following the conquest of Babylon, various groups returned to Jerusalem. Excuse me. And who were these groups? Well, the people who went back to Jerusalem after the conquest of Cyrus weren't the original exiles. Those people were all dead. They'd been there for more than 50 years. The groups that were taken were mostly adults, probably teens, and maybe some adolescents. The little babies and the children may not have been able to make the terrible trip of 1,000 miles from Jerusalem after the siege. They would have been starved and in a very poor condition as far as their health. And so the people who finally survived the march to Babylon would have, over a course of 50 years, all died. Now, they would have had children, of course, and these children would have grown up as inhabitants of Babylon. They would have regarded themselves as Babylonians, much in the way that immigrants into the United States would come, and then their children would regard themselves as Americans. So these individuals who took the offer of Cyrus to return to Jerusalem would have been the children and the grandchildren of the original exiles who had been raised on stories of the old country and the temple, and they went back specifically to rebuild the temple under the leadership of Zerubbabel and others. They were given permission by Cyrus, and at the expense of the Persian government, who had returned the treasures of the temple, they were going to reconstruct the temple. Problems began to develop immediately. We are told that it was almost 20 years before they were finally able to complete the reconstruction of the temple, and those events are laid out very clearly in the Bible. Let's take a look at one of those passages. It says, "This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says, 'The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah.'" Now, as we pointed out, this is in 539 BC when he conquered the city of Jerusalem, which incidentally was almost a bloodless conquest. And very few arrows fired. The Babylonians had fallen into such a decrepit state as far as their army that they really couldn't withstand the Persians, and the city was almost turned over to Cyrus at the time. Now, what we are then told is that the peoples around them set out to frustrate their plans to rebuild the temple, and thus the work of the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, or Darius, king of Persia. Now, that's nearly 20 years of delay, and the question is why? Well, once again, the history of Persia gives us some clues as to why this would have happened. Cyrus conquered the city of Jerusalem in 539 BC, gave permission to the exiles to return. They took a year or two to get organized. They traveled back with their money and their orders and their permission. But a couple of years later, Cyrus died, and the throne was taken by Cambyses. Cambyses his son. Cambyses spent the next 7 or 8 years in Egypt conquering the Egyptians to bring that into the Persian camp. And there was really nobody back home. In fact, there was a revolt in Persia where an individual who pretended to be the brother of Cambyses was trying to take the throne. Now, Cambyses is not mentioned in the Bible, but we've had that 7 or 8 year delay, and then Cambyses, hearing about the rebellion going on, tried to hurry back to Persia, but stabbed himself in his thigh with a sword, got gangrene and died on the trip back, and he was replaced on the throne by a young distant relative named Darius. And Darius required several years to consolidate his throne and his hold and put down the rebellion and punish the various nobility who had participated in this. And so nearly 20 years have gone from the time that Cyrus gave his edict to rebuild the temple to the time when there was finally somebody on the throne and there was some stability in the Persian government. And at that point, the Jewish returnees began to rebuild the temple, and the local people who were trying to interfere once again sent letters to the government to question whether the Jewish returnees had the privilege and the right to rebuild their temple. And this is what we read about in Ezra. The people around them set out to frustrate their plans, and thus the work on the house of God came to a standstill until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Now, at that point, Persia was able to, Darius was able to give them permission to continue with the rebuilding. And as we work through the Bible, we find this. Officials of Trans-Euphrates, and that's the district where Jerusalem was located, sent a letter to the king, which was not a good idea. You don't question the king in those days. But they sent a letter to him saying, now, if it pleases the king, make a search in the royal archives to see if Cyrus really did issue a decree. In other words, they're saying, these folks came back here and said Cyrus gave them permission 20 years ago, but would you please check and see if that really happened? And then when you find out, let us know. In other words, they're making a request and an order of a very powerful king. Now, Darius did indeed check and see that there was a passage in one of the edicts that gave permission. So he wrote back and said, now then, you officials of that province, stay away from there. Don't interfere with this work on the temple of God. But then he went a little bit further. He said, moreover, because you had the audacity to question me, the expenses of these men and the cost of rebuilding the temple are to be paid out of the royal treasury, which is what Cyrus had said, but he said that the money would actually come from the revenues of your tax collections, the revenues of Trans-Euphrates, so that the work won't stop. Now, in those days, tax collectors were obligated to send a certain quantity of tax money to the king, but anything that they collected beyond that was theirs. It was theirs to enjoy and to use, and basically what Darius is saying is, from now on, you will use those monies to help build the temple. We're not going to pay for it out of the central government anymore. Then the Bible goes on to say this. It says, furthermore, and this is an amazing statement in the Bible, if anyone changes this edict, if anyone interferes any more with any of the building of the temple, a beam is to be pulled from his house and he is to be impaled on it. And his house is to be made a pile of rubble. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence. In other words, he's telling these people, don't interfere anymore. It will be a capital crime, and this is what's going to happen to you if you interfere any further. Now, they were able to go ahead, and the Bible tells us that the Jews finished building the temple in the 6th year of the reign of Darius. It took a couple more years once they got started going, and that date is generally placed at about 516 or 515 BC. So this is, I find this to be an incredible story. A pagan Persian king freed the Jews originally, allowed them to go back, and finally in the time of Darius, 20 years later, he allowed for the completion of the building of the temple, and not only that, he threw the full weight of his government behind support for the rebuilding of the temple. Now, Darius died in 485 BC. This was almost 80. This is 30 years after the temple was rebuilt, and his son took the throne. This son of Darius is the focus of the events in the book of Esther. Time is passing. We're many, many years past 589 BC, or 586 BC, when Jerusalem was destroyed. We are almost 100 years later, and the book of Esther tells of various events. Let's take a look at what the Bible says there. It says, Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus. Now that's if you have the King James Version. In all other Bibles, he's referred to as Xerxes, the great king. And in the 7th year of the reign of Xerxes, it was when he loved Esther and put the crown on her head and made her queen. This is generally dated to about 479 BC. And in that particular event, Queen Esther came to him and said, "Spare my people." This was when she had found out that Haman and various enemies within the Persian Empire wanted to eradicate the Jews, eliminate them. And he said, "I and my people have been sold for annihilation, and the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." The Bible then goes on to say they were given permission to defend themselves, and on the 13th day of the month of Adar, the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, and that is celebrated as the festival of Purim. And that's all in the book of Esther. There is a piece of furniture, basically, a doorway from the Palace of Susa to give you a sense of the magnificence of the Persian Empire at this point. This also is on display in the British Museum, but you can see these magnificent wooden gates led into the throne room at Susa. Now, time passed some more. Xerxes died and was replaced by his son Artaxerxes, and we read about Artaxerxes once again in the book of Ezra and also in the book of Nehemiah. And we are getting into another 20 or 30 years beyond the time that we've been talking about with Esther and Xerxes. The Bible passages about Ezra give us this information. During the reign of Artaxerxes, Ezra was a teacher versed in the law of Moses, and he arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month of the 7th year of the king. That's about 558 BC. And he was given permission to appoint magistrates, judges, and administer justice to the people of Trans-Euphrates, all who know the laws of your God. And it goes on to say that whoever doesn't obey the law of your God and the law of the king must be punished by death, banishment, and confiscation of property. Now, from there we move on to Ezra returned and reinstituted the new law that had been formulated, but we then click to passages about Nehemiah, who returned to rebuild the city walls. And if we look at these, it says, "In the 20th year of Artaxerxes, the king granted my requests to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem," and we place that at about 445 BC. And this young man, who was the cupbearer, a position of great responsibility, was granted permission to rebuild the walls, and we're told this happened in 52 days. Here is a picture of some of the excavations around Jerusalem. These are walls that were reconstructed by Nehemiah and the various inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem. And basically they were rebuilt by taking these walls that had been piled at the foundations. They'd just been knocked over, and they repiled the walls, and you can see that they are not nearly as elegant as the original walls would have been. What we have covered in these 12 sessions, the stories of the Old Testament, is the selection of Abraham by God. He was Abram at the time, became Abraham, and it was his task to carry the message of a restored relationship with the God. We've seen the proliferation of a believing community. As they were enslaved in Egypt, returned to Canaan, they created a nation and were again punished with exile in return because they fell away from the proper faith. This has been the Bible is a wonderful, almost breathtaking narrative of God's work in our world leading up to the events that will be played out in the New Testament, and I hope you've enjoyed this overview of the stories of the Old Testament.
Bible Interact is a group of Bible scholars and biblical archaeologists who promote the Hebraic nature of Scripture and view the two Testaments as one unified message. They explain how they use a first-century approach to searching the Scriptures, and they share their methods and discoveries for discussion and dialogue. They invite your comments and participation on BibleInteract.tv, where you can also find more teachings, self-study quizzes, webinars, and interviews.